Right now, as you process these words, approximately 86 billion neurons in your brain are firing in intricate patterns, sending electrical signals across trillions of connections called synapses, consuming about 20% of your body's total energy, despite representing just 2% of your body weight, generating the subjective experience of consciousness that allows you to understand language, form thoughts, feel emotions, and maintain a sense of continuous self across time. And here's what makes this even more extraordinary. The brain you're using to understand this sentence is fundamentally the same structure that allowed your ancestors 200,000 years ago to survive on African savannas. Yet it's flexible enough to master reading, a technology invented just a few thousand years ago, to understand abstract concepts like infinity or justice, to create symphonies and split atoms and contemplate its own existence. Your brain is simultaneously ancient and modern, rigid in its basic architecture, yet remarkably plastic in its specific configurations, operating through principles established millions of years ago, yet capable of behaviors and thoughts no other brain in evolutionary history could produce. And perhaps most mysterious of all, this 3-pound organ generates something that seems to transcend physical matter entirely: the felt experience of being you. The inner subjective world of thoughts and sensations and emotions that exists nowhere else in the universe. The consciousness that right now is aware of itself being described, creating a strange loop where the brain observes itself through the very consciousness it generates. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. This is a space dedicated to exploring the world's most fascinating facts in a calm, meditative way. A place where curiosity meets quietness, where profound truths become companions for drifting off. If you're new to these journeys, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and turn on notifications. These explorations continue because of listeners like you, and your presence here makes all the difference. Tonight, let's explore together the most complex object known to exist in the universe. An organ that contains more connections than there are stars in the Milky Way, that runs on less power than a dim light bulb, yet outperforms any supercomputer in pattern recognition and creative thinking. Let's talk about the human brain. Not just as biological machinery, but as the source of everything you've ever experienced. Every memory you hold, every decision you've made, every emotion you've felt. The very consciousness that's receiving these words right now and transforming them into meaning. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons, specialized cells that communicate through electrical and chemical signals. Each neuron can connect with thousands of other neurons, creating an estimated 100 trillion synaptic connections. To put this in perspective, if you counted one synapse per second, it would take you over 3 million years to count them all. These connections aren't random. They're organized into networks and circuits that have been refined through millions of years of evolution and shaped by your individual experiences since conception. The patterns of connections in your brain are unique, as distinctive as your fingerprint, yet they follow general organizational principles that make all human brains recognizably similar in structure and function. And here's what makes the brain's structure particularly elegant. It's organized hierarchically, with information processing becoming progressively more complex as signals move through different regions. Sensory information from your eyes doesn't go directly to conscious awareness. It passes through multiple processing stages, each extracting different features, each adding layers of interpretation, until what reaches consciousness is not raw sensory data, but a rich, meaningful perception. When you look at a face, early visual areas detect edges and contrasts. Intermediate areas recognize features like eyes and mouths. Higher areas identify the specific person and their emotional expression. And the highest areas connect this perception with memories and meanings. This hierarchical processing happens so quickly, within a few hundred milliseconds, that it feels instantaneous. yet it involves coordinated activity across dozens of specialized brain regions. Which brings us to understand something remarkable about neuroplasticity: the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. For decades, scientists believed that the adult brain was fixed, that neurons couldn't regenerate, that brain structure was essentially set by early adulthood. We now know this is dramatically wrong. The brain constantly rewires itself in response to experience, learning, injury, and environmental demands. When you learn a new skill, playing an instrument, speaking a language, juggling, the brain regions involved literally grow, forming new synapses, strengthening existing connections, even generating new neurons in certain areas. London taxi drivers, who must memorize the city's complex street layout, have enlarged hippocampi, the brain region crucial for spatial navigation and memory, compared to non-taxi drivers, and the size increase correlates with years of experience. This plasticity is most dramatic during development. A child's brain forms synapses at an astounding rate, up to 2 million per second during peak developmental periods. This creates an overabundance of connections that are then pruned based on experience. Connections that are used frequently strengthen and persist, while unused connections are eliminated. This use it or lose it principle shapes brain development according to environmental inputs, allowing adaptation to whatever world the child encounters. This is why early childhood experiences are so formative. The brain is literally wiring itself based on those experiences, establishing patterns that influence thinking, emotion, and behavior throughout life. And this leads to something equally fascinating about critical periods: time windows when the brain is especially sensitive to certain types of input. Language acquisition has a well-documented critical period. Children exposed to language before puberty typically achieve native fluency, while those exposed later rarely reach the same proficiency despite similar effort. This isn't about motivation or intelligence, but about brain plasticity. The language processing networks are most flexible during childhood, becoming progressively less malleable with age. Similar critical periods exist for visual development, social attachment, and other domains. These periods reflect times when the brain is preparing itself for crucial skills, ready to wire itself according to environmental input, after which the windows partially close as brain structure becomes more fixed. But there's more to brain development than just childhood. The brain continues maturing well into the mid-20s, with the prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment, planning, impulse control, and considering consequences, being among the last regions to fully develop. This explains why adolescents and young adults often show poorer decision-making, greater risk-taking, and less ability to regulate emotions compared to older adults. The teenage brain isn't defective, it's in transition, with emotional and reward systems fully mature, but regulatory systems still developing, creating a temporary imbalance that influences behavior. Understanding this neurodevelopmental trajectory has implications for education, criminal justice, public health policy, and parenting strategies. Consider for a moment the sheer complexity of what your brain accomplishes effortlessly. Right now, it's maintaining your heartbeat, regulating your breathing, adjusting your blood pressure, controlling body temperature, coordinating hormone release, all without conscious awareness. Simultaneously, it's processing sensory information from your environment, maintaining your posture, generating thoughts about what you're hearing, accessing memories to provide context, creating emotional responses, planning future actions, and monitoring itself for errors or unexpected events. This massive parallel processing occurs continuously, coordinating trillions of neural events per second, creating the seamless, unified experience of consciousness, despite involving activity distributed across the entire brain. And here's what makes this coordination particularly mysterious. There's no central controller, no homunculus sitting in a control room making decisions. The brain is a distributed network, where coordination emerges from interactions between regions rather than being imposed by a master controller. Different brain areas specialize in different functions: visual processing, language production, emotional response, motor control. But they constantly communicate, influence each other, and integrate their activities. Consciousness emerges from this coordination, though exactly how remains one of neuroscience's deepest mysteries. We can identify which brain regions are active during conscious experiences, but we can't fully explain how patterns of neural firing generate subjective experience. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sense of being you experiencing these things. Which brings us to the question of consciousness itself, and what neuroscience reveals about it. Consciousness isn't a single thing, but involves multiple components that can vary independently. There's wakefulness, being awake versus asleep or unconscious. There's awareness, being conscious of something versus processing it unconsciously. There's self-awareness, recognizing yourself as an entity distinct from the environment. There's metacognition, thinking about your own thoughts. These components can dissociate. You can be awake but not self-aware, as in some neurological conditions, or aware of stimuli without being able to report them consciously, as in certain types of brain damage. The neural correlates of consciousness, brain activity patterns associated with conscious experience, involve widespread communication between brain regions, particularly interactions between sensory cortex and prefrontal areas. When stimuli reach consciousness, they trigger global workspace activation, signals broadcast throughout the brain, becoming available to multiple systems for reasoning, memory, action planning. Unconscious processing remains more localized, confined to specific sensory or motor regions without engaging this global network. This suggests that consciousness functions to integrate information across brain systems, allowing flexible, context-appropriate responses rather than automatic reactions. And this leads to something equally fascinating about the brain's energy efficiency. Despite its enormous computational power, the brain runs on about 20 watts, similar to a dim light bulb. This is millions of times more energy efficient than artificial systems performing similar computations. A supercomputer capable of simulating even a small portion of brain activity requires megawatts of power and massive cooling systems. The brain achieves this efficiency through several strategies, using spikes of activity rather than continuous signaling, processing information in parallel rather than sequentially, storing and processing information in the same structures rather than separating memory and processing, and operating at relatively slow speeds. Neural signals travel at speeds far below electrical signals in computers, but compensating through massive parallelism. But there's more to brain function than efficient computation. The brain is fundamentally a prediction machine, constantly generating models of the world, predicting what will happen next, and updating those models when predictions fail. Perception isn't passive reception of sensory input, but active construction. Your brain predicts what it expects to see, hear, and feel based on past experience and context, then compares predictions with actual sensory input. When they match, perception proceeds smoothly. When they mismatch, attention is drawn to the unexpected element, and predictions are updated. This predictive processing explains many perceptual phenomena. Why you can read words even when letters are scrambled. Your brain predicts the word and fills in details. Why you sometimes hear words that weren't actually spoken. Your brain predicted them and generated the experience. Why optical illusions work. They exploit prediction mechanisms. This predictive nature extends beyond perception to action, thought, and emotion. Before you move, your brain predicts the sensory consequences of that movement and uses the prediction to guide action. When you plan future actions, you're essentially running simulations, predicting outcomes of different choices. Even emotions reflect predictions. Anxiety is your brain predicting threat, Excitement is predicting reward. Disappointment is experiencing worse outcomes than predicted. The brain is perpetually running simulations, generating predictions, testing them against reality, and refining its models. This makes the brain not just reactive, but proactive, not just responding to the world, but constantly anticipating it. And here's what makes brain function particularly dependent on chemistry. While we often focus on electrical signals, the action potentials neurons use to communicate, these electrical signals are actually triggered by chemical processes, and the effects of signals on receiving neurons are entirely chemical. Neurotransmitters, chemical messengers, are released from one neuron and bind to receptors on another, either exciting it, making it more likely to fire, or inhibiting it, making it less likely to fire. The brain uses dozens of different neurotransmitters, each with distinct effects. Glutamate is the primary excitatory transmitter, GABA the primary inhibitory. Dopamine modulates motivation and reward. Serotonin affects mood and impulse control. Norepinephrine influences attention and arousal. Acetylcholine supports learning and memory. Small changes in neurotransmitter levels can profoundly affect brain function and behavior. Too little serotonin is associated with depression, too much dopamine with psychosis, altered GABA function with anxiety. This is why psychiatric medications work. They modify neurotransmitter systems to restore more typical function. Antidepressants increase serotonin or norepinephrine. Antipsychotics block dopamine receptors. Anti-anxiety medications enhance GABA. These medications don't cure the underlying conditions, but can significantly improve symptoms by altering brain chemistry. This chemical dimension of brain function reminds us that the brain is not just an electrical network, but a chemical system, and that mind and consciousness emerge from these chemical processes as much as from electrical ones. Consider for a moment how drugs and chemicals can alter consciousness. Alcohol reducing inhibitions and impairing coordination. Caffeine increasing alertness and focus. Psychedelics generating vivid hallucinations and altered self-perception. Anesthetics completely eliminating consciousness. These substances work by binding to receptors and altering neurotransmitter systems, changing the patterns of neural activity that generate experience. The fact that consciousness can be so dramatically altered by chemicals demonstrates that consciousness is fundamentally a physical process. Change the brain's chemistry or electrical activity, and you change conscious experience. This has profound implications for understanding consciousness, free will, and the relationship between mind and brain. And alongside chemical influences, there's the question of brain regions and their specialized functions. The brain isn't a uniform mass, but a collection of specialized regions that evolved at different times and serve different purposes. The brainstem and cerebellum, evolutionarily ancient structures, control basic functions like breathing, heart rate, balance, and coordinated movement. The limbic system, including the amygdala, hippocampus, and hypothalamus, processes emotions, motivation, memory formation, and regulates hormones. The cerebral cortex, the wrinkled outer layer that expanded dramatically in human evolution, supports higher functions like language, abstract reasoning, planning, and conscious awareness. Within the cortex, different regions specialize further. The occipital lobe at the back processes vision. The temporal lobes on the sides handle hearing, language comprehension, and memory. The parietal lobes at the top integrate sensory information and support spatial awareness. The frontal lobes, particularly the prefrontal cortex, support executive functions, planning, decision-making, impulse control, working memory, attention regulation. These regional specializations aren't absolute. Regions communicate constantly, and complex functions involve networks spanning multiple areas. But they provide organizational structure that makes the brain's complexity more comprehensible.
And as you rest here, your awareness beginning to drift, your thoughts becoming less focused and more dreamlike. Recognize that everything you're experiencing right now, the sound of these words, the meaning they convey, the feeling of relaxation spreading through your body, the gentle pull towards sleep, all of it is generated by your brain, by patterns of neural activity that somehow, mysteriously, create the rich inner world of consciousness. Your brain is working right now to process language, to generate calm, to gradually transition from waking to sleeping consciousness, following patterns established by evolution and refined by your individual life experiences. Performing this ancient dance between consciousness and unconsciousness that every human brain has performed throughout our species' history. A dance that continues now, carrying you gently, inevitably, toward the rest your brain needs, toward the sleep that allows tomorrow's consciousness to emerge refreshed and renewed. Memory is not a single system, but multiple systems working in parallel,
each with distinct characteristics and neural mechanisms. When you remember what you ate for breakfast this morning, you're using episodic memory. Memory for personally experienced events located in time and place. When you remember that Paris is the capital of France, you're using semantic memory. Memory for facts and general knowledge detached from specific learning experiences. When you ride a bicycle or type on a keyboard, you're using procedural memory. Memory for skills and habits that operate largely without conscious awareness. These memory systems can be damaged independently. Someone with amnesia might lose the ability to form new episodic memories while retaining semantic knowledge and procedural skills, or vice versa, demonstrating that memory isn't unitary, but distributed across different brain regions and mechanisms.
And here's what makes memory formation particularly fascinating. It occurs in stages that require different neural processes. The initial encoding happens rapidly. Information enters sensory memory, lasting just seconds, then transfers to short-term or working memory if attention is directed to it. Working memory holds information temporarily. Phone numbers, sentences you're currently hearing, mental calculations, maintaining it through active neural firing in the prefrontal cortex. This maintenance is effortful and limited. You can typically hold about 7 items in working memory simultaneously, and without rehearsal or deeper processing, the information fades within 20 to 30 seconds. For memories to persist longer, they must undergo consolidation, a process that stabilizes them into long-term storage. This consolidation initially depends on the hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe that binds together the distributed cortical representations of an experience. When you experience an event, different aspects, visual features, sounds, spatial location, emotional tone, are processed in different cortical regions. The hippocampus links these distributed representations, creating a coherent memory of the unified experience. Over time, through repeated reactivation during sleep and quiet waking periods, these memories become more cortically based, less dependent on the hippocampus, gradually integrating into long-term knowledge networks. Which brings us to understand something remarkable about how memories change over time. Memory is not like video recording, faithfully preserving experiences for later playback. Instead, memories are reconstructive. Each time you recall an event, you're rebuilding it from fragments, influenced by current knowledge, expectations, and emotions. This reconstruction can introduce distortions. You might remember events differently than they actually occurred, incorporate information learned after the event into the original memory, or even develop completely false memories of events that never happened. These memory distortions aren't signs of defective memory, but intrinsic features of how memory works. The same flexibility that allows creative thinking and inference
also makes memory malleable. This malleability has profound implications. Eyewitness testimony, once considered highly reliable, is now known to be surprisingly unreliable. Witnesses can be confident yet wrong, influenced by leading questions, suggestions, or their own expectations. Childhood memories, especially from early years, are particularly susceptible to distortion. Studies show that people can be led to remember events from childhood that never occurred through suggestion and imagination exercises. This doesn't mean all memories are false, but it means memory should be understood as a constructive process rather than a storage system, as interpretation rather than recording. And this leads to something equally fascinating about the emotional dimension of memory. Emotional events are typically remembered more vividly and persistently than neutral events, a phenomenon with evolutionary logic, since remembering threats, dangers, and significant social events is crucial for survival. The amygdala, the brain's key emotion processing center, modulates memory consolidation based on emotional significance. During emotional arousal, the amygdala triggers the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which enhance memory consolidation in the hippocampus. This is why you likely remember exactly where you were during major personal or historical events: your first kiss, a car accident, September 11th if you're old enough, while you've forgotten thousands of ordinary days. But there's more to emotional memory than enhanced recall. Traumatic memories can become pathologically persistent, intruding into consciousness through flashbacks, nightmares, and triggered emotional responses. The core features of post-traumatic stress disorder. In PTSD, the normal emotional processing that should reduce a memory's emotional charge fails to occur, leaving the traumatic memory in a raw, unprocessed state that feels as threatening as the original event. The memory doesn't properly consolidate into the past, but remains emotionally present, as if the trauma is ongoing rather than over. Treatment for PTSD often involves exposure therapy, where the traumatic memory is repeatedly recalled in a safe context, allowing emotional processing to finally occur, transforming the memory from a present threat into a past event. Consider for a moment the paradox of memory and identity. Your sense of continuous self across time, that the person you are now is the same person who existed yesterday and will exist tomorrow, depends entirely on memory. Without memory, there's no personal continuity, no life story, no stable identity. Patients with severe amnesia, unable to form new episodic memories, live in a perpetual present. They can't remember what happened 5 minutes ago, can't anticipate a personal future, exist in a kind of eternal now. This demonstrates how much our sense of self is constructed from memory. We are, in important ways, our memories, our stories about ourselves, our narrative continuity across time. Yet memories are selective, distorted, incomplete. You remember just a tiny fraction of your experiences, biased toward emotionally significant events, influenced by how often you've recalled them, shaped by your current self-understanding. The life story you tell yourself, the narrative that defines who you are, is a construction, an interpretation of selected memories filtered through present perspectives. This doesn't make your identity illusory, but it reveals identity as an active, ongoing construction rather than a fixed fact, as something your brain continuously creates rather than simply discovers. And here's what makes the brain's learning capabilities particularly remarkable. It can acquire new information and skills throughout life, though the efficiency varies with age and the type of learning. Children excel at implicit learning, acquiring knowledge without conscious awareness, as in language acquisition, where children extract complex grammatical rules without explicit teaching. Adults often excel at explicit learning, consciously studying information, using strategies, connecting new knowledge with existing frameworks. These different learning styles reflect different brain systems. Implicit learning relies more on subcortical structures like the basal ganglia. Explicit learning more on prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. Optimal learning engages multiple systems and strategies. Distributed practice, spacing study sessions over time, produces better retention than massed practice, cramming everything into one session. Retrieval practice, testing yourself, is more effective than passive review. Elaborative encoding, connecting new information with existing knowledge, generating examples, explaining concepts, creates stronger memories than shallow processing. Sleep, as discussed earlier, is crucial for consolidation. Understanding these principles can dramatically improve learning efficiency, yet they're often ignored in educational settings where cramming, passive reading, and sleep deprivation are common. But there's more to brain function than memory and learning. Attention, the ability to selectively focus on some information while ignoring other information, is fundamental to how the brain manages the overwhelming amount of sensory input constantly available. Without attention, you'd be paralyzed by sensory overload, unable to focus on relevant information, unable to form coherent thoughts or perceptions. Attention acts as a filter, enhancing processing of attended information while suppressing irrelevant distractions. This filtering isn't perfect. You've likely experienced selective attention failures like change blindness, failing to notice obvious changes in visual scenes, or inattentional blindness, failing to see unexpected objects when focused on something else. Attention is limited. You can't fully attend to multiple complex tasks simultaneously. When you think you're multitasking, you're actually rapidly switching attention between tasks, with switching costs that reduce efficiency and increase errors. This is why texting while driving is so dangerous. Attention switches between driving and texting, and during switches, you're effectively doing neither, creating moments of dangerous inattention. The brain's attention systems evolved for environments where multitasking wasn't required. You typically dealt with one important thing at a time, and modern demands for continuous multitasking exceed our attentional capacity. And this connects to something deeper about the brain's reward and motivation systems. The neurotransmitter dopamine plays a crucial role in motivation, pleasure, and learning. Dopamine is often called the pleasure chemical, but this is oversimplified. It's more accurately described as signaling reward prediction and motivating behavior toward rewards. When something unexpectedly good happens, dopamine neurons fire, signaling, "This was better than predicted," which reinforces the behaviors that led to the reward. Over time, dopamine firing shifts from the reward itself to cues predicting the reward. You feel excitement seeing a favorite restaurant, anticipating the meal, and this anticipation motivates you to enter. This dopamine-based learning underlies both adaptive and maladaptive behaviors. It's why you repeat actions that led to success. Your brain learned they predict rewards. But it's also why addiction is so powerful. Drugs directly stimulate dopamine release, creating a chemical prediction error that says, "This is amazing, do it again," even when the behavior is actually harmful. The addicted brain has learned to prioritize the drug above natural rewards, overriding rational judgment through hijacked motivation systems. Understanding addiction as a learning disorder rather than a moral failing helps explain why simple willpower is often insufficient. The brain has been rewired to strongly motivate drug-seeking behavior, which brings us to the question of decision-making and whether we have free will. Neuroscience has generated controversy by showing that unconscious brain activity precedes conscious awareness of decisions. Studies where participants decide when to move their finger show brain activity predicting the decision several seconds before the person consciously experiences making the choice. This seems to suggest decisions are made unconsciously, with conscious awareness being an after-the-fact illusion. However, interpreting these findings is complex. The brain activity might represent preparation or inclination rather than final decision. Consciousness might play a role in vetoing decisions rather than initiating them. And the very concept of free will is philosophically problematic. What would a free decision mean if it's not caused by your brain states, which are shaped by genetics and experience? Most neuroscientists and philosophers now favor compatibilist views. The idea that free will and determinism can coexist if we define free will appropriately. Your decisions are caused by your brain, which is shaped by factors beyond your control. Yet they're still your decisions, reflecting your values, knowledge, and reasoning. You're not free from causation, but you're free from external coercion, and that's the kind of freedom that matters practically. Understanding that decisions emerge from brain processes doesn't eliminate responsibility or agency. It contextualizes them within a naturalistic framework.
And here's what makes the brain's language capabilities particularly unique to humans. While many animals communicate, human language has features, syntax, recursion, displacement, abstraction, that appear unique. Language allows us to express infinite meanings from finite elements, to talk about things absent or imaginary, to build cumulative culture by transmitting complex knowledge across generations. The brain regions supporting language, Broca's area in the frontal lobe for production, Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe for comprehension, plus interconnecting networks, show dramatic expansion in humans compared to other primates.
Language and thought are intimately connected, though exactly how remains debated. Some argue language shapes thought, that the language you speak influences how you perceive and reason about the world. Others argue thought is more fundamental, with language being a tool for expressing pre-existing concepts. Evidence supports both directions. Language can influence thought, as in how different languages carve up color space or spatial relations. Yet thought exists in non-linguistic forms, as in visual spatial reasoning or musical thinking. Language and thought likely interact bidirectionally, with language providing a powerful tool for complex thought, while also being shaped by the thoughts we need to express.
But there's more to human cognition than language. Social cognition, understanding and predicting others' mental states, engages specialized brain networks, including the medial prefrontal cortex and temporoparietal junction. These regions support theory of mind, recognizing that others have beliefs, desires, and intentions different from your own. This capacity emerges in childhood and is impaired in conditions like autism, where social understanding can be difficult, despite intact or even superior non-social cognition. Social cognition makes human cooperation possible. You can't effectively collaborate, negotiate, or form complex societies without understanding others' mental states.
And alongside social cognition, there's self-awareness, the ability to reflect on your own mental states, to think about your thinking, to maintain a concept of yourself as an entity persisting across time. This metacognition, supported by prefrontal cortex, allows self-monitoring, error detection, strategy adjustment. You can notice when you're confused, recognize mistakes, change approaches. Self-awareness has evolutionary advantages. It enables learning from mistakes, planning based on self-knowledge, regulating behavior according to long-term goals. Yet it also creates uniquely human vulnerabilities: self-consciousness, anxiety about others' perceptions, rumination about past failures, worry about future outcomes.
Consider for a moment the brain's incredible adaptability in the face of injury.
The same neuroplasticity that allows learning can support recovery from brain damage. After stroke, intact brain regions can partially compensate for damaged areas, taking over functions that were lost. Young children show even more remarkable recovery. Children who undergo hemispherectomy, removal of an entire brain hemisphere to treat severe epilepsy, can develop relatively normal cognitive function, with the remaining hemisphere reorganizing to support functions typically handled by both hemispheres. This demonstrates the brain's potential for reorganization, though recovery is typically incomplete. Some functions are harder to relocate than others. And as you rest here, your thoughts becoming slower and more fragmented, your brain transitioning from active waking processing toward the different patterns of sleep. Appreciate that this transition, this letting go of waking consciousness, is itself a remarkable neurological process. Your brain is gradually reducing activity in arousal systems, increasing activity in sleep-promoting regions, shifting neurotransmitter balances, altering network dynamics, preparing for the memory consolidation, synaptic reorganization, and cellular restoration that will occur during sleep. You don't consciously control this transition. Your brain does it automatically, following circadian signals and homeostatic sleep pressure, following patterns established across millions of years of evolution, following the same processes occurring in every human brain that's ever entered sleep. A process as natural and necessary as breathing, as ancient as consciousness itself. Emotions, which feel so immediate and personal, are actually complex brain states involving multiple systems working in coordination. When you feel fear, it's not a single thing happening, but a cascade. The amygdala rapidly detects potential threats, triggering the hypothalamus to activate the sympathetic nervous system, releasing adrenaline and cortisol, increasing heart rate and blood pressure, sharpening attention, preparing muscles for action, while simultaneously sending signals to the cortex that generate the conscious feeling of fear. This entire cascade occurs within milliseconds, often before you consciously recognize what frightened you. The emotion is not just a feeling, but a coordinated brain-body response that evolved to promote survival. Fear prepares you to fight or flee. Disgust prevents you from consuming toxins. Joy motivates you to repeat rewarding behaviors. Sadness signals loss and elicits support from others.
And here's what makes emotions particularly interesting from a neuroscience perspective.
They're not purely reactions, but involve predictions. Your brain doesn't wait for threats to appear and then react. It constantly predicts potential threats based on past experience and context, pre-activating emotional responses that color your perception. When you enter a dark alley at night, your brain predicts potential danger, generating mild fear that heightens vigilance before anything threatening actually appears. This predictive emotion influences what you notice. Threat-relevant stimuli capture attention more readily when you're already anxious, creating a feedback loop where emotions shape perception, which confirms and strengthens the emotion. This explains why anxiety can become self-perpetuating. The anxious brain predicts threats, interprets ambiguous situations as dangerous, and treats the perceived dangers as confirmation that anxiety is warranted. Which brings us to understand something remarkable about emotion regulation: the ability to modulate emotional responses, which depends heavily on prefrontal cortex regions that can inhibit or reshape amygdala-driven emotional reactions. Cognitive reappraisal, interpreting situations differently to change emotional responses, is particularly effective. If you're nervous about a presentation, reinterpreting the situation as an exciting opportunity rather than a threatening evaluation can reduce anxiety by changing the emotional predictions your brain generates. If you're angry about someone's behavior, considering alternative explanations for their actions can diminish the anger by altering how the situation is perceived. These cognitive strategies don't suppress emotions, which is often ineffective and even counterproductive, but transform them at their source by changing the interpretations that generate them.
The development of emotion regulation follows brain maturation. Children have limited regulatory capacity because their prefrontal cortex is still developing, making them more emotionally reactive. Adolescents have mature emotional systems, but still developing regulatory systems,
creating the emotional intensity characteristic of teenage years. Adults with mature prefrontal function have better regulatory capacity, though individual differences remain. Some people naturally regulate emotions more effectively than others, and this capacity can be further strengthened through practice, therapy, or mindfulness training. Understanding emotion regulation as a brain skill rather than a personality trait helps normalize emotional struggles and suggests they can be addressed through training rather than being immutable characteristics.
And this leads to something equally fascinating about the brain's stress response systems and their effects on cognition and health. Acute stress, short-term challenges like giving a presentation or escaping danger, activates the sympathetic nervous system and releases cortisol, enhancing attention, memory, and physical performance. This acute stress response is adaptive, mobilizing resources to deal with immediate challenges. But chronic stress, sustained activation of stress systems over weeks or months, becomes harmful. Prolonged cortisol elevation impairs memory formation, suppresses immune function, increases inflammation, damages hippocampal neurons, and increases risk for depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, and other health problems. The effects of chronic stress on the brain are substantial. The hippocampus shrinks, impairing memory. The amygdala enlarges, increasing emotional reactivity. The prefrontal cortex shows reduced activity, diminishing executive function and emotion regulation. These changes aren't permanent. Reducing stress allows partial recovery. But they demonstrate how sustained psychological stress creates physical brain changes that affect cognition, emotion, and behavior. This bidirectional relationship between mind and brain means that psychological interventions, stress reduction, meditation, therapy, can produce measurable brain changes, demonstrating that the divide between mental and physical health is artificial. But there's more to stress than individual responses.
The brain's stress systems evolved for acute physical threats, predators, rivals, environmental dangers that required immediate action. Modern stressors, work deadlines, financial concerns, relationship problems, global news, rarely require physical action yet activate the same stress response, creating chronic physiological arousal without resolution. Additionally, social evaluative threats, fear of judgment, social rejection, status loss, strongly activate stress systems, perhaps because in ancestral environments, social exclusion could be life-threatening. Understanding this mismatch between modern stressors and evolved stress responses helps explain why stress is so prevalent and provides insight into managing it. Finding ways to discharge stress energy, reframing threats as challenges, building social support, practicing stress reduction techniques.
Consider for a moment the brain's relationship with sleep, which we've touched on before, but deserves deeper exploration in the context of brain health.
Sleep is not passive downtime, but active brain maintenance, clearing metabolic waste, consolidating memories, pruning unnecessary synapses, restoring neurotransmitter balance, regulating gene expression. Chronic sleep deprivation creates widespread brain dysfunction, impaired attention, memory, decision-making, emotional regulation, increased risk for psychiatric disorders and neurodegenerative diseases. The glymphatic system that clears brain waste operates primarily during sleep, particularly deep sleep. Without adequate sleep, toxic proteins accumulate, potentially contributing to Alzheimer's and other dementias over decades.
Different sleep stages support different brain functions.
Deep sleep is crucial for memory consolidation and physical restoration. REM sleep supports emotional processing and creative insight. Sleep spindles in stage 2 facilitate memory transfer. Disrupting specific sleep stages selectively impairs the functions they support. This is why sleep quality matters as much as duration. Fragmented sleep that doesn't allow completion of full cycles provides inadequate restoration despite adequate time in bed. Prioritizing sleep isn't laziness, but necessary maintenance for brain health and optimal function.
And here's what makes the brain's aging process particularly important to understand. The brain doesn't inevitably decline dramatically with age. While some changes are normal, processing speed slows, working memory capacity decreases slightly, multitasking becomes more difficult, many cognitive abilities remain stable or even improve. Vocabulary, semantic knowledge, emotional regulation, wisdom, and the ability to see big-picture patterns often enhance with age. The aging brain has different strengths than the young brain, compensating for some losses through experience and strategic approaches. However, pathological aging, dementia including Alzheimer's disease, represents disease processes distinct from normal aging. Alzheimer's involves accumulation of amyloid plaques and tau tangles that damage and kill neurons, particularly in the hippocampus and cortex, progressively impairing memory, reasoning, and daily functioning. While age is the primary risk factor, Alzheimer's is not inevitable. Many people maintain cognitive function into their 90s and beyond. Understanding the distinction between normal aging and dementia is crucial for recognizing when changes warrant medical evaluation and for reducing stigma around normal age-related changes. Which brings us to the question of cognitive reserve, the brain's resilience to damage. People with higher cognitive reserve can tolerate more brain pathology before showing symptoms. Education, intellectually demanding careers, complex leisure activities, multilingualism, and social engagement all build cognitive reserve, apparently by creating more neural connections or more efficient networks that can compensate when damage occurs. This is why two people with similar brain pathology might show different symptom severity. One has more reserve capacity, allowing continued function despite damage. Building cognitive reserve throughout life, through learning, social engagement, physical activity, and healthy lifestyle, is one of the best strategies for maintaining cognitive health in aging. And alongside cognitive health, there's the growing field of neuroplasticity-based interventions, using the brain's capacity to reorganize itself to treat various conditions. Constraint-induced movement therapy for stroke recovery forces use of impaired limbs, promoting reorganization of motor cortex. Cognitive training programs aim to improve attention, working memory, or processing speed through repeated practice. Brain-computer interfaces allow paralyzed individuals to control devices with neural signals. These interventions capitalize on plasticity, though effectiveness varies, and research continues to determine which approaches work best for which conditions. But there's more to brain intervention than training. There's also direct brain stimulation. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, uses magnetic fields to stimulate or inhibit specific brain regions, showing promise for treating depression and other conditions. Deep brain stimulation, DBS, involves surgically implanted electrodes that deliver electrical signals to deep structures, effectively treating Parkinson's disease symptoms and being explored for other conditions. These interventions are more invasive, but can provide dramatic benefits when other treatments fail, demonstrating that directly modulating brain activity can alter symptoms, thoughts, and behaviors. And this connects to something deeper about the ethics of brain intervention and cognitive enhancement. If we can treat disorders by modulating brain activity, can we, should we, enhance normal function? Medications like stimulants can improve attention in people without ADHD. TMS might enhance memory or creativity. Future technologies might allow more precise brain modulation. These possibilities raise ethical questions. Would enhancement create unfair advantages? Would pressure to enhance become coercive? Would we lose something important about human variability and limitation? How do we distinguish legitimate treatment from problematic enhancement? These questions become increasingly pressing as neuroscience advances, requiring thoughtful public dialogue about how we want to use expanding capabilities to modify brain function. Consider for a moment the relationship between brain and mind. the ancient mind-body problem that neuroscience approaches from a materialist perspective. Everything you experience, thoughts, emotions, sensations, consciousness, correlates with brain activity. Damaged specific brain regions and specific mental capacities are lost. Alter brain chemistry, and mental states change. This strongly suggests that mind is what brain does, that mental phenomena are brain phenomena, that there's no separate non-physical mind. Yet this scientific consensus doesn't fully explain subjective experience, why neural firing feels like something, how physical processes generate the qualitative character of consciousness. This hard problem of consciousness remains controversial, with some arguing it's fundamentally unsolvable, others that it will yield to future neuroscience, still others proposing that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality rather than emerging from matter. Regardless of philosophical position, practical neuroscience proceeds by studying correlations between brain and mind, using mental states to infer brain processes and brain measures to understand mental states. This approach has been remarkably productive, revealing how perception, memory, emotion, and reasoning work at neural levels. Whether this will eventually explain consciousness fully remains uncertain, but it's clear that understanding the brain is essential for understanding the mind, even if brain science alone might not capture everything about subjective experience.
And here's what makes individual brain differences particularly significant. No two brains are identical. Genetic variation, developmental experiences, learning history, injuries, and countless other factors create unique brain configurations. This neural diversity underlies psychological diversity. Different people think, feel, and perceive differently, partly because their brains are wired differently. Understanding this helps explain why people respond differently to the same situations, why some interventions work for some people but not others, why communication and mutual understanding require effort. We're literally seeing the world through different neural architectures. This neural diversity includes neurodevelopmental variations like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia, which reflect different brain organization rather than simple deficits. While these conditions create challenges in typical environments, they also bring different strengths. Many autistic individuals excel at pattern recognition and systematic thinking. Many people with ADHD show enhanced creativity and hyperfocus. Many dyslexic individuals have strong spatial reasoning and narrative abilities. The neurodiversity framework recognizes these conditions as variations rather than purely pathologies, advocating for accommodating different neural configurations rather than only trying to normalize them. This doesn't mean these conditions don't cause real difficulties, but it contextualizes them within natural human variation rather than viewing them solely as disorders. And alongside natural variation, there's the impact of culture on brain function. While basic brain structure is universal, cultural experiences shape neural development and organization. Language shapes auditory cortex. Speakers of tonal languages show different neural processing of pitch. Literacy creates new neural pathways. Learning to read recruits visual cortex regions and creates connections between language and visual systems. Cultural practices influence attention. Western cultures emphasize focal attention, East Asian cultures more holistic attention, and these differences appear in neural activity. Culture and brain co-evolve across generations. Cultural practices shape brains, which create capacities that enable new cultural developments in an ongoing cycle. And as you rest here now, your awareness dimming, your thoughts fragmenting and drifting, your brain gradually shifting from waking network configurations towards sleep states, recognize that this remarkable organ that you've been learning about is the same organ doing the learning, comprehending these words about itself, reflecting on its own nature and function. The brain observing the brain, consciousness contemplating consciousness. This recursive self-reference is perhaps the brain's most extraordinary feat. The ability to turn its analytical capabilities on itself, to study its own mechanisms, to understand how it generates the very understanding being generated.
This strange loop, the brain understanding that it's a brain, consciousness aware of being a product of neural activity, creates a kind of vertigo, a dizzying sense of paradox. Yet it's simply the natural consequence of sufficiently complex information processing turning inward, becoming self-referential, creating the capacity for self-knowledge that makes neuroscience possible. And now, having contemplated these complexities, having exercised your brain in understanding itself, you can release that effort, allowing the natural transition towards sleep, trusting that your brain knows how to accomplish this without conscious guidance, following ancient patterns, entering the restorative states that will consolidate today's learning, prepare for tomorrow's experiences, and allow this extraordinary organ to maintain itself, repair itself, reorganize itself, continuing its lifelong journey of adaptation and function. The human brain develops not in isolation, but in constant interaction with the social world. And this social shaping begins at the very start of life. Newborn brains are remarkably underdeveloped compared to other primates. Human infants are born essentially premature, unable to walk or feed themselves, requiring years of intensive care. This extended developmental period, while creating vulnerability, provides enormous flexibility. The brain wires itself according to the specific social and physical environment it encounters. Early social experiences literally build brain architecture, establishing patterns of attachment, emotional regulation, and social understanding that influence relationships throughout life. Secure attachment to caregivers creates neural patterns supporting trust and healthy relationships. Neglect or abuse disrupts normal development, creating patterns associated with emotional dysregulation, anxiety, and relationship difficulties that can persist unless addressed through therapeutic intervention. And here's what makes early social experience particularly crucial. The brain develops in a use-dependent manner, with frequently activated pathways strengthening while unused pathways are pruned. Infants whose emotional expressions are consistently responded to develop neural circuits linking emotional expression with social support, learning that emotions are communicable and others can help regulate them. Infants whose emotions are ignored or punished develop different circuits, learning to suppress emotional expression and handle distress alone. Neither pattern is inherently good or bad. They're adaptations to different environments, but they create different emotional styles that affect adult relationships, parenting approaches, and mental health vulnerabilities. Understanding emotional patterns as learned neural responses rather than fixed traits opens possibilities for change through new experiences and therapeutic interventions. Which brings us to understand something remarkable about mirror neurons, brain cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing that action. Discovered accidentally in macaque monkeys in the 1990s, mirror neurons appear to exist in humans as well, though their exact role remains debated. These neurons may support action understanding, imitation learning, and perhaps empathy. When you see someone hurt, similar neural patterns activate as when you yourself experience pain. This neural resonance could underlie our ability to understand others' actions and feelings directly, not through logical inference, but through simulation. Your brain mirrors what it observes, creating an internal model of others' experiences that allows intuitive social understanding. The full significance of mirror neurons is still being researched, and initial excitement about them explaining everything from language evolution to autism has been tempered by more nuanced understanding. But they represent an important discovery about how brains enable social cognition, not through detached observation, but through neural participation, creating shared representations between self and other that blur boundaries and enable the deep social connection that characterizes human experience. You understand others partly by becoming them neurally,
experiencing echoes of their actions and feelings in your own brain.
And this leads to something equally fascinating about empathy and its neural basis. Empathy involves both emotional resonance, feeling what others feel, and cognitive perspective taking, understanding what others think and believe. These components engage different neural systems. Emotional empathy involves limbic regions, including the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, which process your own emotions and activate when you observe others' emotions. Cognitive empathy involves prefrontal and temporoparietal regions supporting theory of mind, reasoning about others' mental states. Both components are important. Emotional empathy without cognitive understanding can lead to emotional contagion and burnout, while cognitive understanding without emotional resonance can lack motivational force. Healthy empathy balances both aspects. Individual differences in empathy have neural correlates. People with higher empathy show stronger activation in empathy-related brain regions when viewing others' suffering. Psychopathy, characterized by reduced empathy and increased antisocial behavior, is associated with reduced amygdala and prefrontal function, particularly in circuits processing others' distress. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but helps explain it. The brain mechanisms supporting empathy and moral concern are impaired. Some research suggests empathy can be strengthened through training like loving-kindness meditation, which increases activation in empathy-related regions, suggesting neural empathy circuits remain plastic in adulthood. But there's more to social cognition than empathy. The brain dedicates substantial resources to processing social information, recognizing faces, interpreting body language, understanding social hierarchies, tracking reputations, predicting others' behavior. Face processing involves specialized brain regions including the fusiform face area, which responds selectively to faces and is more active for faces than for other objects. People with prosopagnosia, face blindness, have damage or dysfunction in these regions and cannot recognize even familiar faces, despite normal object recognition and other visual abilities. This demonstrates how specialized the social brain is, with dedicated neural machinery for processing the most socially relevant stimuli. Social pain, rejection, exclusion, loss, activates brain regions overlapping with physical pain processing, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex. This neural overlap helps explain why social pain feels genuinely painful, why phrases like heartbreak or hurt feelings feel accurate rather than metaphorical. Social connection was crucial for ancestral survival. Being excluded from your group could be deadly. So evolution apparently co-opted physical pain systems to signal social threats, creating emotional pain that motivates reconnection. This also explains why social support reduces physical pain. Holding a loved one's hand during a painful experience genuinely reduces pain-related brain activity, demonstrating that social connection and pain are neurologically intertwined. Consider for a moment the brain's reward systems and how they respond to social stimuli. The ventral striatum, particularly the nucleus accumbens, processes reward prediction and learning. It activates for food, money, drugs, and also for social rewards like positive feedback, cooperation, reputation enhancement, and charitable giving. Adolescents show especially strong striatal responses to social rewards like peer approval, which helps explain why peer influence is particularly powerful during teenage years. Understanding that the brain treats social acceptance as rewarding, literally activating the same systems that respond to food or money, helps explain human motivation for social connection, conformity, status-seeking, and pro-social behavior. And here's what makes social brain function particularly plastic. Social skills can be learned and improved throughout life. People with social anxiety can reduce their symptoms through exposure therapy and cognitive restructuring. Individuals on the autism spectrum can develop compensatory strategies for understanding social cues. Even normal social development continues through adulthood as people encounter new social contexts and challenges. The social brain isn't fixed, but continually adapts to social experiences, learning from successes and failures, refining its predictions about social situations and appropriate responses. Which brings us to the question of language processing in the brain and its relationship to thought and communication. Language involves multiple processes: phonological, sound patterns; semantic, meaning; syntactic, grammar; and pragmatic, context-appropriate use, each supported by overlapping yet distinguishable brain networks. Speech production primarily involves Broca's area and surrounding frontal regions, motor cortex for articulation, and connections to semantic and syntactic networks. Speech comprehension involves Wernicke's area and surrounding temporal regions, plus connections to semantic networks. Reading and writing recruit visual cortex and create new connections between visual and language areas. Bilingual individuals show overlapping, yet distinct representations for different languages, with varying degrees of separation depending on when and how each language was learned. Language disorders from brain damage reveal functional organization. Broca's aphasia impairs speech production. Patients understand language but struggle to speak, producing effortful, telegraphic speech lacking grammatical markers. Wernicke's aphasia impairs comprehension. Patients speak fluently but with impaired meaning, often unaware their speech is incomprehensible. Other aphasias selectively impair reading, writing, naming, or repetition. These dissociations show that language isn't a unitary faculty, but a set of related but separable processes, each with distinct neural substrates that can be damaged independently. And this connects to something deeper about inner speech: the verbal thoughts that constitute much of conscious cognition for many people. When you think in words, language-related brain areas activate, particularly Broca's area, though less intensely than during actual speech. This inner speech may serve multiple functions: planning actions, self-regulation, working memory maintenance, reasoning. Some people report little or no inner speech, thinking more in images or abstract nonverbal forms, demonstrating that conscious thought need not be linguistic. But for those who think verbally, inner speech is a primary mode of consciousness, demonstrating how language, initially evolved for communication, becomes a tool for organizing and directing thought itself. But there's more to brain function than cognition and social processing. The brain controls all bodily functions through the autonomic nervous system, which operates largely outside conscious awareness. The sympathetic branch mobilizes energy, increasing heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, releasing glucose, preparing for action. The parasympathetic branch conserves energy, slowing heart rate, promoting digestion, supporting rest and recovery. These systems typically balance: sympathetic activation during activity or stress, parasympathetic dominance during rest. Chronic stress disrupts this balance, maintaining sympathetic activation even when not needed, contributing to health problems. Mind-body practices like meditation, yoga, and deep breathing work partly by activating parasympathetic systems, promoting relaxation and recovery. The brain also regulates circadian rhythms through the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a small cluster of neurons in the hypothalamus that maintains approximately 24-hour cycles even without external time cues. Light detected by specialized retinal cells resets this clock daily, synchronizing internal rhythms with the external day-night cycle. Disrupting circadian rhythms through shift work, jet lag, or irregular sleep schedules impairs cognitive function, mood, immune function, and metabolic health. The brain's timekeeping systems evolved under natural light-dark cycles and function optimally when aligned with those cycles. Modern life often conflicts with these rhythms, creating chronic circadian disruption
that affects brain function and overall health.
And here's what makes the gut-brain connection particularly interesting. The enteric nervous system, sometimes called the second brain, contains millions of neurons lining the digestive tract, communicating bidirectionally with the brain through the vagus nerve and chemical signals. Gut microbiota, trillions of microorganisms living in your intestines, influence brain function through multiple pathways, producing neurotransmitters, affecting immune function, influencing vagus nerve signaling. Research suggests gut microbiota composition affects mood, anxiety, cognition, and even autism symptoms. This gut-brain axis demonstrates that the brain doesn't function in isolation. It's part of an integrated body system where gut health affects mental health and vice versa. Consider for a moment the brain's metabolic demands and what they reveal about its importance. Using 20% of the body's energy, despite being just 2% of body weight, the brain is metabolically expensive. This high cost suggests that cognitive capacity provides enormous survival advantages. Otherwise, evolution would reduce brain size to save energy. The human brain is particularly large relative to body size, and this encephalization, disproportionate brain expansion, occurred over the last few million years of human evolution, likely driven by social complexity, tool use, language, and other cognitive demands that rewarded larger, more capable brains. But brain size alone doesn't determine intelligence. Neanderthals had larger brains than modern humans, yet modern humans apparently outcompeted them. Brain organization, connectivity, and efficiency matter as much as size. The human cortex, particularly prefrontal regions, is elaborated beyond what size alone would predict. White matter pathways connecting brain regions are extensive. The balance between specialized regions and flexible integrative networks creates capabilities that transcend simple computational power. Intelligence emerges from organization as much as from raw capacity. And alongside structure, there's the question of consciousness and whether it's uniquely human. Many animals show behaviors suggesting consciousness, responding to pain, showing preferences, learning from experience. But whether they have subjective experience like humans remains debated. The neural correlates of consciousness involve widespread cortical integration. And while many animals have cortical structures, they differ significantly from human cortex. Great apes, dolphins, elephants, and some birds show behaviors suggesting sophisticated cognition, including self-recognition, tool use, and social intelligence, suggesting they may have forms of consciousness, though possibly quite different from human experience. The distribution of consciousness across species remains one of neuroscience's open questions. And as you drift now toward the deepest rest, your brain gradually transitioning from waking consciousness toward sleep's distinct states, reflect on the extraordinary journey this organ represents. The human brain is the product of nearly 4 billion years of evolution, beginning with single cells, developing nervous systems, brains, consciousness, language, culture, science. The long chain of development that culminates in the brain reading these words, understanding them, contemplating its own nature. Your individual brain represents both this ancient lineage and your unique life history. Genetic inheritance from countless generations, combined with experiences that have shaped your particular neural configuration, making you specifically you, with your particular thoughts, memories, skills, quirks, and capacities. This brain has carried you through every moment of your life, generating every experience you've had, every thought you've thought, every emotion you've felt. It's been with you always, working constantly even when you're unaware, maintaining life, processing information, creating the continuous stream of consciousness that is your inner life. And now, it prepares for sleep, following patterns as old as consciousness itself, releasing waking awareness, entering states that will restore and prepare it for tomorrow's experiences. Trust this process, this ancient rhythm,
this natural transition. Your brain knows what to do. Let go. Rest deeply, and allow the extraordinary organ that is reading these final words to accomplish what it's been designed by evolution and refined by experience to do. To rest, to restore, to dream, to prepare for the next day's consciousness, the next moment's awareness, the continuing journey of being alive, being conscious, being you.